Question 1. What is your understanding of Episcopal ministry? And how will this understanding be reflected in your approach to leadership and ministry?
One of the richest resources that we have for understanding Episcopal ministry is the ordination service, where we find out that this is a ministry of leadership, it's a ministry of support for the people, and also a ministry of the continued renewal of the Church. So the bishop is importantly a focus of unity, and not just within the diocese, but across the whole wide communion of the Church, and therefore has this special responsibility for guarding the faith and order of the Church. So what we believe and how we do things. He or she is the chief pastor, by which I don't mean the go-to of last resort, but rather the person who has the welfare of the entire Church at heart. The bishop is the chief liturgical officer, has a special responsibility for maintaining the integrity of our worship. Not necessarily uniformity, but integrity. He or she is a teacher and a preacher, so interpreting the gospel not just to the Church, but very importantly, on behalf of the Church, to the world, who may not know. And because the bishop, one hopes, is a person who's been around the block a few times, he or she can function as a mentor, and especially to the clergy. So then the question is, how would I go about doing this work? Thankfully, we have moved away from a model of monarchical episcopacy, where the bishop kind of rules by fiat. And my own leadership style is much more collaborative. I prefer to affirm people's gifts, to mobilize them and their energy and the passions and the gifts of people to get things done. But that said, I don't see the bishop as merely a moderator. The bishop needs to be a person of courage and fortitude, willing to get in there with big ideas and hard questions. And I actually think that that's part of the work of leadership. As a communicator, so the teacher, preacher who stands for the Church, the bishop needs to be visible. And we need people to know that the Anglican Church in Southern Alberta exists and is a force for good. So that requires visibility, and it means that the bishop needs to be media savvy and social media savvy. As a focus of unity, the bishop needs to be at the table of the wider Church in a kind of ambassadorial role, as both a voice and an ear. So that means that I would welcome invitations to encounter the Church in other places. And then lastly, as chief pastor or mentor to the clergy, I would want to be approachable with an open door policy. And I also place great stock in recruiting excellent leaders, whether lay or clergy, and ensuring that those people are adequately challenged.
Question 2. Think about a situation where conflict threatened the unity of the community. What did you do to deal with the conflict? What was the result? How did you deal with unresolved issues? Looking back on this situation, what would you do differently?
So there are various kinds of conflict, right? There's first-party conflict, where I've got something against you, and second-party conflict, where you have something against me, and then third-party conflict, where somehow I've been invited into a conflict between two other people. Since I imagine that that third-party conflict would be pretty normative in a bishop's life, let's go with one of those examples. So I was the rector of a parish with two distinct congregations, one favoring contemporary worship with electric cars and pretty bad music, and they were pretty much the NDP at prayer. And then on the other side, we had a very traditional congregation, Book of Common Prayer, semi-professional choir, and they were the conservative party at prayer. So what we had was this classic divide between social conscience, or a view of church as engaging with the world, and an aesthetic sensibility, a view of church as being primarily about our worship and our prayer life. Now, for the most part, those two groups managed to stay out of each other's hair, except when it came time to set the budget. And so we had one group, the social conscience people, calling the 1115 people a bunch of uptight skinflints, and the 1115 people calling the 930 people bleeding heart liberals. And to make things worse, we had a governance structure which exactly mirrored that same divide, with the skinflints in charge of the money and the bleeding heart liberals in charge of the mission. So that's the picture. So how did we deal with it? I didn't deal with it by myself. I had people of goodwill across the spectrum who were willing to work together. I also recognized I had to be a dual citizen, loving both of those groups really and truly equally if I was going to have any credibility. And we began with analysis, and we realized that we had two congregations and two boards with completely opposite corporate personalities. And so what we did was we set about mixing it up, so that we now had people across the spectrum of opinion always at either table. That's what we did. We also established a worship committee, so we still valued a diversity of liturgical experience, but people were in the room talking with each other about how we could make sure that at least the underlying theology of our worship was consistent. And no matter what genre of worship, that we would strive for excellence. And then the other thing we did was we got some of the so-called skinflints involved in a program to feed homeless people hot lunch every day. So the results of this, and it took a long time because we're talking about a sea change here, but the results of this were good. I mean, it worked. We have a congregation that to this day still has its liturgical preferences, but has become a standard bearer for excellence in liturgy of any kind, and also is a leader in hands-on outreach to the poor. What would I do differently? Actually, not much. I described a failure in my written materials, so I'm allowed a success. And really this went pretty well. I might have called people on the name calling, on their behavior. But I say that with 20 years hindsight, and I wear my authority in my 50s a whole lot more comfortably than I did in my 30s. I'm not sure that would have helped at the time. So the main thing about this story is that this was a situation where conflict was actually a catalyst for positive change.
Question 3. The Church needs new models for ministry as membership and attendance decline, and we seek to respond to our changing relationship with the world. As Bishop, how would you support the desire to renew our life and ministry within the Diocese of Calgary?
You know, our changing relationship with the world isn't comfortable for us. We've lost influence, respect, reach, but I'm not sure it's a bad thing. It could just be the tonic we need for complacency. Because through the history of the Church, beginning from the Babylonian exile, the people of God have been the clearest about their identity, the strongest in their faith when they were under siege, as we are. And I also have to say that in over 30 years of ordained ministry, my overwhelming experience of the Church has been of growth in rural settings, small towns, suburban, downtown core, urban. And in most cases, that happened because of two things. One was kind of spiritual renewal, people getting it about their faith, and the other was a renewed sense of service to the world, people having something they could work on together. And my sense is that the bishop needs to support the renewal of life and ministry in those ways, to encourage the renewal of deeply intentional faith and practices. We just cannot afford to be poorly informed about our faith or wishy-washy about our commitment to Christ. Not if we want people to know we're here. And then we need to try some things. The bishop can encourage creativity, imagination, collaboration. We need to find out what's working in other places. And then we need to find ways of funding experiments that belong to us all. And lastly, we just need to be clearer than we are about our mission as a diocese. There is a lot going on that's really good, but we just need to be more aware of it and to own it as a community.
Question 4. 5 years after you have left office as the Bishop of Calgary, how would you like people in the diocese to remember your episcopacy? What legacy do you hope to leave the diocese?
First of all, I'm a little uncomfortable with a phrase like your episcopacy, as if I owned it, right? Church is in trouble when it thinks of itself as a community gathered around a minister or a bishop rather than as a ministering community. So with that caveat, there are some hopes I have for the Diocese of Calgary, and in general, that we would have a much greater sense of cohesion with a proper sense of pride in belonging to something bigger than ourselves. And then specifically, we will have taken the challenges of rural ministry and urban decline seriously, that we'll have become a more mission-oriented church, that while respecting tradition, we would be known as a diocese where some really creative things are happening. That we would continue to attract top-notch clergy and to retain them because they just want to be here. That we will be on what I would call the mattering map of agencies outside of the church, because we'll have a reputation for being engaged contributors on issues that I think must surely grieve the heart of God, like poverty and homelessness and access to mental health care and water and any number of issues. And then last but not least, that we'll have found some ways of addressing this issue of chronic underfunding, which saps the energy and kills imagination faster than anything, and we need to do something about it.